Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please make yourself comfortable and we will start the session in a couple of minutes. We are waiting for the other attendees to join in. I think we can start now. So hello, everyone. I, Samriddhi Agarwal, on behalf of the Rethinking Economics India Network, warmly welcome you all to the conference on reforming economics education in India, Pluralistic Perspectives. This conference is jointly organized by Rethinking Economics India Network and the Department of Economics, Satyavati College, University of Delhi. We are now starting with session 5 titled Designing Alternatives for and Prospects of Pluralistic Economics Education in India. The session will be chaired and run by Dr. Arjun Jayadev, who is the Director of Arts of the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University, where he teaches economics, and is also a senior economist at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. His research combines quantitative and theoretical analysis of finance, development, political economy, and intellectual property. He has also been closely involved with the Core Economics Project. Amongst the presenters today, we have Radhika Lobo from Vidhyashilp University and Anima Chowdhury, Monami Sinha from Delhi University, Sara Bardhan from Pandit Deendayal Energy University, and Surbhi Kesar from SOAS London. The session will start with the chairperson's opening remarks, followed by 4 presentations for about 15 to 18 minutes each. And towards the end, we will have a dedicated time for audience discussion and question and answers anchored by the chairperson. And now I kindly request Arjun to take over and conduct the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samriddhi, and welcome to everybody. It's been a wonderful 2 days so far, and with a lot of open questions that were raised and a lot of very useful suggestions made over these last 4 or 5 sessions about how one might go about rethinking, as in fact the organization is called, rethinking how we're doing economics as a subject. And I say doing because it's not just about teaching, it's about research, it's about our own conceptualization of what economics is. Of course, in India, the challenges are, multifold, apart from the question of actually having syllabi already being set up and various kinds of administrative and bureaucratic hassles. There is also the question of what one should be doing for an Indian context as opposed to for, economics just writ large. So these are very interesting questions that were posed over the last couple of days, and we'll, I'm sure, have another session in which exactly these kind of questions will be talked about with different sorts of angles. As somebody's already introduced our speakers, I won't do that again. But what I'd ask the speakers to do is to please keep your remarks to between 15 to 20 minutes. At the end, and we'll just go through the order. I believe we'll start with Radhika, and then go on to Monami, followed by Sara, and then followed by Surbhi in that order. So please keep it to 15 to 20 minutes so that we have enough time for questions and answers at the end. All right, so let's just begin. For the first session, or for the first speaker, we will have Radhika speaking about a case for inclusion of a course in gender economics. Over to you, Radhika.
Thanks so much, Arjun. I will just share my screen and then start off. Okay, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So could you enable screen sharing?
I believe that will be best. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Yes, that's working now. Thank you. Yeah. Just give me a minute. All right. Okay, so I guess y'all can see my screen, and so good afternoon, everyone, and hi, Arjun. I don't know if you recall, you had come to Christ University. I had invited you there when a colleague of mine and we were working on a funded research project, and I had requested you to give us some inputs there. So I was very happy to note that you're chairing this session, and thank you all the organizers for giving my co-author, that is Anima, who is an independent researcher, and me, Radhika, this opportunity to make this presentation on the topic that you can see on the screen. I'm from Vidhyashilp University, which is a private state university located in Bangalore, a very new one. So, we've already had 5 or 6 sessions on, and so therefore a lot has already been spoken on what is pluralism in economics. So that's why we just put these 2 lines here. And the important point that we wanted to make is that we as teachers of economics probably need to reiterate to our students who will be future economists that whenever they are trying to get a solution to an economic problem, they need to look at it from a broader perspective. And we felt that this broader perspective could come from pluralism, and this one specifically, the effort that we have made is revolving around inclusiveness and interdependence across disciplines. Yesterday, we had heard Alex Thomas, and he was talking about thematic pluralism and theoretical pluralism. So I think our paper definitely revolves around thematic pluralism. So having said that, it's not new. The fact talking about women's issues is not something new. It has been coming up intermittently for quite some time, but it's only in the 70s that this link between, say, gender issues and the fact that it could create certain kind of problems for economic development was made public in that sense of the word. So therefore, what is now being accepted is that listening to gender issues and incorporating the issues in a macroeconomic policy is very, very important. So what we have done is we have provided some literature review to substantiate this in our paper. So to start with, one of them is that of Gail Ferrant. She is a gender economist from OECD, and she proposes and very strongly believes that evidence-based sort of system. That means unless you have some kind of an evidence to base your thoughts on, you can't have a proper policy formulated. So therefore, it's very, very essential that every country works towards creating these kind of evidences so that the policies can be formulated accordingly. Multilateral bodies like, UNDP, etc., have already come up with various kinds of evidences with regard to, say, pay disparity or literacy skills, what kind of disparities are there, or labor participation rates, or maybe, my pet peeve, or maybe the pet peeve of everybody, women on this show, that is a disproportionate burden of unpaid care work. So these are some of the things that UNDP came out in its UNDP gender equality strategy. Similarly, the World Economic Forum every year publishes what is called as the global gender gap. And this, the 2021 report suggests that it's going to take about 136.6 years to cover this gap. The only country which has kind of covered it a little over 90% is Iceland. So since most of us, not all of us can shift to Iceland, right? So we need to make some effort to try and see that the gender gap is reduced. And we think one of the ways to do so is introducing a paper on gender economics at the UG level itself. So right from the 7th plan time period, UGC has been advocating the introduction of gender-based policies, gender-based studies in the curriculum. Similarly, any of us who have gone through, say, a NAC accreditation, you will see that in the very first criteria itself, there are several questions which lead you towards finding out are there any of the, how many courses are there on gender and such kind of things. So what Anima and I have done is that we did a literature review to find out, so basically there is no need to reiterate the fact that there is a need for a gender economics program. So now the next question which arises is what should be the topics or what should be the modules that should be included in a gender economics paper or a course, because not too many universities have this kind of a paper itself or a course itself. So the ones that we've listed on the screen in red, these are the modules that we are suggesting, of course, among others that people would like to take. So what we'll do now is I'll just run you through very briefly, these topics, these modules, and we have made suggestions on how they could be taught. That means the pedagogical approach to each of them. So of course, based on time, Arjun, you could just stop me whenever, and then I'll stop there. So based on the time, I'll explain all or some of these modules. The rest are there in our paper any which way. So, again, our literature review indicates that despite lots of efforts that are being made, the inequalities in terms of opportunities, as well as quality of employment, this tends to persist. Of course, there's a lot of evidence from the literature review which suggests that such inequalities can be reduced if women's participation in labor markets increase. That means that it helps in propelling growth and minimizing equality among certain other benefits also. So therefore, we think that if this is theorized and developed as a separate course, as a module within the gender economics paper, it could really help in a big way. So the pedagogical approach that we are suggesting is that maybe you can start with introducing to the students the traditional labor theory, get them to then question that, is this allocation happening correctly? That means correctly meaning, is there some allocation where women are also being what is the labor market participation of women? Is that equitable? So the students can start questioning this sort of a thing. And that's when it will hit them that the theory and the policy need to be aligned with each other. So what we found a very, very good reference for helping this particular work, and that is the work published by ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Conference. The publication is titled Achieving Gender Equality. Here there are several cases that are discussed on how women labor are either unable to secure opportunities or that their wages are low. And it could really help the students examine and understand what is the real life situation, because if they are living in urban areas or even within urban areas, they may not really understand the reality which is there actually. The second module that we suggest is on women and education. So, the literature that we reviewed showed that the number of girls who complete primary education is about 89% as compared to only 77% who complete secondary education. And the same report suggested that developing countries and underdeveloped countries, where there is, girls don't study even 12 years, there the loss in terms of productivity is somewhere between 15 trillion to $30 trillion for them, right? So like it's written there clearly, primary education is not just enough. So here we thought that we, because when you give such kind of statistics, it's quite alarming and it hits you hard, but it probably just remains with you till the time that you're in the classroom. The moment you walk out, it's all wiped out. So maybe this could become a non-taught module. And with the help of the faculty, they could have, a survey in 2 districts where there are starkly different educational levels for girls. Within India, because a short while ago Arjun, I remember, was talking about the Indian context, and they could use the same 6 areas which the World Bank report suggests, which are listed in italics there, and they could try and mark their findings in these 6 areas. We understand that it's a kind of repetition of the work that is being done by World Bank, but they have already indicated the variables. So why reinvent the wheel? And at the undergraduate level, the idea here is for the students to get a hands-on feeling and understand what is the real situation. Say in India, the World Bank report could probably give an overall situation. Here they would understand what's really happening at the ground level. A third module would be women and financial markets. Just give me a minute, please. Yeah. So, the gender blindness which is there in the financial markets is like the main cause why women are not entering financial markets. And there's like there's a need or an urgency to make certain kind of financial products or offer financial products which are women-centric, because that's the reason that women are not entering into the financial markets. That's what our review of literature suggests. So therefore, Anima and I have been suggesting that there could be a introduction to what is termed as gender analytics here for the students, and they could try and find out that what are the reasons that there is an exclusion of women from financial markets, and this could help them to, say, research, evaluate products and services through a gender lens, and this could propel them in the future to innovate products which are, conducive to both sexes. Yeah. I think I'll skip these to this particular module, that is women, health and nutrition, not because it's not important, because a lot has been said on and understood on the fact that women require a certain kind of diet and health requirements in order for the development to be at a particular pace. And we also found that a lot of syllabi on gender economics does include that. But one topic which we found was not really there was women and infrastructure. Now, most people would just think that if the government is constructing a highway, or if the highway is already constructed, it's going to be used by everybody. So the benefit of that is going to come to everyone, or anyone who wants to work on the construction during the construction process can easily do so. The answer is no, and that's what we found from so much amount of review of literature. And we came across a very, very good report by ADB, Asian Development Bank, which has categorized its own investment into 4 classification, 4-tiered, and the first 2 are those where the investments projects are giving direct benefits to the women. So it has set a target that 55% of its own investments should be in category 1 and 2 at least. So what we are, and this is really something that students wouldn't think about. A road is there for everyone to walk on. So here again, we suggest that maybe half the class could work on that World Bank related project and the other half could work here. And you could conduct a mini survey to find out like what kind of infrastructure, first of all, is necessary for people in and around your campus or your home. And then based on the kind of questions which are there probably in the ADB one, that how many of them are really providing direct benefit to women. The last topic that we suggest should be included is women and climate change. We have written a lot in our paper, but on the slide, I have just put 2 lines because the review of literature definitely suggests that these kind of factors like climate change do affect vulnerable population, especially women, much more than any other. And one of the papers talked about how during a drought or a tsunami, women who are there in these camps, because everybody is displaced and everybody has to be put in these evacuation camps. And in such camps, women are more vulnerable, and therefore they can be harmed or assaulted by strangers. So it is something which is very scary, and it's not something that one would normally think about. And it is something that our students need to understand. And therefore, here we suggest that there could be like a seminar method. They could look at these case studies. There are so many wonderful research papers that have been written on this, which highlight the issues that women have faced in such cases. And this will help the students to be sensitized to such situation. And who knows, in the future, when they go on to become policy makers, they will pay heed to such kind of things. So that's the conclusion that we have drawn, that understanding these gender issues becomes very important to formulate correct policies, and this can start right at the undergraduate level. Academic bodies like UGC or accreditation bodies like NAC have started this, not just to achieve national objectives, but also the SDG. So we have suggested about 5 to 6 topics here right now. There could be so many more, and we have also suggested certain specific pedagogical approaches So not only is our economics curriculum pluralistic, we are also suggesting a pluralistic approach to teaching this itself. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'd like to just conclude by leaving this thought with you. And happy, Anima and I are happy to take questions at the end whenever the forum is open. Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Radhika. I mean, this is also your timing was impeccable. Exactly 18 minutes. So thanks so much for this kind of overview of how you might want to include gender, a case for a gender-specific course. There are probably many questions that will come around this. There are 2 comments in the box, and I will just leave you to take a look at them, and maybe something that you can address when the first when you open up, because I think, as you said, it probably makes more sense to have a more broad-based discussion when everybody has spoken. So let's move now to Monami, who will present now on the topic is economics in terms of actual people and issues. It's a great title. So Monami. You're on mute. I'm sorry. You're still on mute.
Sorry. So I'll just share my screen. I'm Monami Sinha. I teach economics in Delhi University, and I want to talk about my experience as a teacher of economics in Delhi University for the past 14 years. And that's what my paper is about. I'll just share my screen, but before that, I just want to say a few things. While we teach, and all economics teachers will identify this with this, that, just a second, I have to accept things. Okay. So basically, So I'm just going to talk about my experiences as a teacher in Delhi University, and especially one particular book that I teach, which is ManQ, Introductory Macroeconomics. And also I'm going to discuss the fact that we do not teach any other theory or any other concept other than capitalism and capitalist theory and neoclassical theory to our economic students. Once upon a time, we used to have something called economic systems, a course called economic systems, but that has been discontinued. And the students have no exposure to any alternate theory. They get to learn about feudalism, colonialism, monarchy, but they never come to know about socialism or Marxism or some alternate versions of, or some alternate theories. So that is problematic, because I'll point out the problems that are there in these textbooks and how do we, how we should we resolve these problems. I'll just share my screen first. Can you see my slides? Arjun, can you confirm? I just do a thumbs up, it's fine. Okay, so so my paper is economics in terms of actual people and issues. Why I named this paper so is because the examples, the case studies, the stuff that, so I teach ManQ to BA program and also economics honors students, and some of the examples are ridiculous. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just, would it be possible to just put it on full screen?
Would it be possible to what?
To make the PowerPoint on full screen mode. It's right now.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so that because it's hard to read from my screen. So just press the presentation mode.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. So the first problem I noticed about the way I teach is that I teach a very dehumanized version of economics, and economics is something to do with the choices people make and in the economy and their welfare and their consumption. So I don't know why we teach such dehumanized neoliberal learning of undergraduate economics. So the person whom I teach is Gregory Mankiw, and there is a history to his there's a history to him, as in that in 2011, when the Occupy movement was going on, he teaches at Harvard, and his entire class did a walkout saying that we cannot be learning this kind of economics which does not concern itself with people. It just concerns itself with profit motive, and it concerns itself with corporates, and it just the protest was protesting against the Occupy movement was protesting against the neoliberal policies of the US, because workers were suffering, minimum wages was being discussed, and at that point the Harvard students walked out. But yet his textbook is taught all over the world still, and especially in India. And so I look at the case studies, or that's the second thing that I'll do. I look at the case studies that he studies in his chapters, and frankly, it's hilarious. I mean, it's really funny. If you read his book, you will see that the case studies are so funny, and you would actually laugh if they were not tragic. For instance, he's asked for a free market will cause black marketing, so it's fine, and things like that. I'll show you the examples. And also we have something in behavioral economics called framing effects. Framing effects is basically how you frame your what you're saying to people and how you influence them. We are always under some influence of advertisements, election campaigning, and so on and so forth. So framing effects are very, very real, and they happen. For instance, the NRA in America, which is the organization which pushes selling of guns and pushes the right of Americans to hold guns in spite of so many school shootings, has two different advertisements for two different sets of people. It tells the liberals that it's your democratic right. If the government ever becomes tyrannical, you can use your guns. On the other hand, the same people will go to the radical, regressive, right-wing people who are racist and tell them that you need to own guns because the black man is coming for you. So and that's a subliminal messaging when they go to the right-wing people versus if they go to the liberals. So that's called framing effects, and you can read up about it. And these books that we teach have definite framing effects, and they are subliminally or very openly endorsing capitalism, and actually not even capitalism, neoliberalism. And they only teach neoclassical theory. They do not teach any alternate theories which might appeal to you more logically if you are exposed to them, but the students are not even aware of the fact that an alternate theory exists, right? So for instance, the Mankiw book, initially in the first chapter, it has the 10 principles of economics. The first principle of economics has always been the trade-off between efficiency and equality. And if most our economic students here, they would know what is equality. Equality is the size of the pie and the equal distribution of the pie. And efficiency has to do with, the size of the economic pie and the tastes of people. I'll explain it to you as in, so efficiency is a concept, Pareto efficiency is a concept which says that you need to have your economy in such a situation that no one person can be made better off without making someone worse off. And the neoclassical economists are obsessed with efficiency. They are constantly harping on the fact that we cannot tamper with the choices of people, the tastes of people. We need to be at a point where we have reaped maximum benefits from redistribution. Anything else that happens will cause some sort of disbenefit to one person, and we can't allow that. Now, equality says that everyone has to be allocated in such a way that they more or less have the same level of standard of living. They have access to the same, the same welfare, the same everything. However, that requires redistribution, taking away money from the rich to the poor, which neoclassicalists and capitalists completely don't like. So they say it's against efficiency, and but remember that efficiency is also an allocation which gives everything to one person and nothing to another person is also an efficient allocation. Because the minute you try to take away something from the person who has everything, you're actually harming him. So efficiency will say that this is a perfect allocation, whereas people who are more concerned about egalitarianism will believe in redistribution and taxation. However, look at this word that they use is that welfare policies reduce efficiency. When the government redistributes income from the rich to the poor, it reduces the reward for working hard. So as a result, people work less. Now look at I have made it in bold, working hard. So between 2016 and 17, Ambani almost doubled his wealth. During the pandemic, we added the number of billionaires. I'm sure they were working really hard when they doubled their income and they doubled their profits and they doubled their net worth and they doubled their everything that they had. So they were probably working 24/7 while the workers in the factories were lazing around. This is the kind of subliminal messaging that we are giving to our students, that the rich are working hard and the poor are actually wastrels living on handouts from the government, which is taken away from the middle class or the rich people, thereby giving them disincentives to work, and hence the rich people do not want to produce more. They reduce their the size of the pie, and the whole economy suffers. And this is what we're teaching students, and it's very harmful because these students are the ones who will go into policy making, decision making seats of power, and apply these kind of principles. Now, another thing which is at the root of neoclassical theory is that rational people think at the margin. What is it that, again, we know what is marginal. If you're an economics student, you will know that neoclassical economics says that you will keep on consuming till one extra unit gives you more happiness than what you spend for it. And producers will keep on producing till one extra unit gives them more profit or gives them more income than what the cost of making that unit. And all these individuals will take individual decisions, and they'll all come together, and there'll be a demand and supply curve based on that. And that will decide the market price. And it's a beautiful way of operation, and the government should not interfere. And he has asked the question, why is water so cheap while diamonds are so expensive, and so on and so forth. And so they constantly talk about margins. Now, if you think about it, this thing about margin and making that one extra product, you will realize how inhuman it is. For instance, we went through this pandemic, this COVID pandemic, right? We saw with our own eyes that hospitals were not equipped. Even in the richest countries, hospitals were struggling with hospital beds. They were struggling with ventilators. Forget about India, even countries like America and Italy were struggling, and so many people died and without getting treatment. So that is exactly what working at the margin means, because the hospitals, which are private entities, will always have the exact number of beds that is required for them to make a profit. If they have so on an average, they'll calculate how many people are there who are sick at any given time, and I will, as a hospital owner, make just as many rooms as required at any given time. And when there is something like a pandemic or an epidemic that happens, the hospitals are not prepared for it, because the capitalist is thinking at the margin. He is thinking, or she is thinking, that if I have an extra bed which lies empty for the whole year, I'm actually making a loss. So I should have just as many beds as that gives me a profit out of the last unit, which is the marginal unit. We saw what a humanitarian crisis that kind of economics caused. And yet we teach this to our students as the only theory that is there in this world, and nothing else can work. We have so much of so much of income inequality. 123 individuals in our country own 23% of our 1/4 of our GDP. There's so much inequality where you can see it in front of your eyes, where people can't get anything to eat, and yet we are touting this as the best theory that can be applied, and everything should be privatized, and this government goes on to privatize everything and lets the free market forces come in and sell the product, the commodity, whatever it might be. So this is the marginal utility theory, which basically the underlying theory of neoclassical economics is the supply curve and the demand curve. The demand curve is downward sloping because with each extra unit that you get, you have diminishing marginal utility, and the supply curve is upward sloping because with every extra unit you produce, you incur a higher cost, and hence you have to have a higher income in order to justify you making that extra unit of commodity. But that's completely fallacious and it's illogical, because the whole concept of utility is very subjective, right? Every person values goods in a different manner. So how do you make one demand curve to show the utilities of everyone in the economy? So the assumptions are very trivializing. They talk about goods that are homogeneous. They talk about a level playing field where there is none. There is no level playing field in this world. There are some people who are really rich, there's some people who are really poor, and generationally poor or rich. It's not that they earned the money with hard work. They actually inherited it from their parents, or they got the opportunities to study in elite institutions. So in that case, how do you assume that every consumer is a homogeneous entity and every commodity is a homogeneous entity, and based on that we'll make a demand curve, right? So they are treating market price on the basis of some abstract, subjective thing called utility, right? And it does not make sense. Similarly, supply curve, they're saying that people need to be compensated more because, you know, you are increasing production, you need to be compensated more. But the scaling effects say differently, that if you are scaling up your production, then each extra commodity requires lesser and lesser cost. You have set up the industry, you set up the factory, you've set up the machines. Now your extra cost is lesser. So how can you assume that the supply curve is upward sloping? And for all the marginal theory, sophisticated language things, it's basically saying that market price is at the intersection of demand and supply. That's it. We are leaving it to the demand and supply. Now, what are the examples this guy is using is what I'll tell you about. However, I want to just, Arjun, can you tell me how much time I have left exactly?
You have about, you've taken about 14 minutes, so maybe another 6-7 minutes.
Okay, so I don't have much time. So there is an alternate theory which Marx has suggested, which says that every commodity has value because there was some raw material which labor worked on. So the reason there's wealth in this world is not just because of natural resources, it's also because labor has worked on it, right? If you think about it, wood is useless unless you, some carpenter makes a chair out of it. So Marx has this labor theory of value, which says that a commodity has two values, use value and exchange value. And exchange value is a very quantitative measure, which says that there is some labor working on every commodity can be compared. See, a loaf of bread and a chair cannot be compared. But the only way that they can be compared is by the amount of labor that goes into it. And that is the only way we can compare the two commodities and determine the exchange value, which is basically the market price. It's a very straightforward, logical way of doing it. Instead, capitalist theory suggests that we construct these arbitrary curves, which are based on very trivializing assumptions. They are illogical assumptions, they are not realistic assumptions, and based on that, we decide on the market price. Whereas Marx has a very scientific method of determining the market price. Now, I'm not saying you have to follow Marxian theory or Marxist theory, but what I am saying is that why is it not introduced to the students? Why are they not taught this alternate theory, where the theory that is being taught is full of loopholes, it's full of a lot of contradictions, a lot of things that don't make sense. Why is it? And also it results in a world which has environmental degradation, forest fires, income inequality, weird infections like COVID, which come out of farm production. And you're telling me, and we are telling the students that this is the only way to go about it. This is a success story, that half or more than half the population of the world lives in abject poverty, that every one of us at some point are going to be affected by the environmental degradation, and our children are getting irreversible lung damage, and a little child in Chhattisgarh cannot get rice, and while Ambani prints a card for his daughter's wedding, which is worth lakhs of rupees. So are you telling me that this is the perfect system that we have and there is no other alternative? I think the students need to be exposed to other alternatives, and they are not. For whatever reasons, the capitalists are very insecure. Otherwise, if they thought that Marxist thought was not so great, they would have introduced the students to it just for academic reasons, right? So this is a demand supply thing. Dual character of so Marx said that there's a dual character. I would really want people who are attending this conference to go up and read what Marx has talked about in his first volume in the Capital, which is the dual character of a commodity. And it's very logical and scientific, and how we can come up, we can determine the price of a commodity, not based on arbitrary curves, but actually based on what goes into a commodity, which is labor. It is a very, very dangerous thought for capitalists, because we are attributing the entire wealth in society to the workers. And whatever the profiteers are making out of it is basically loot, and they don't like that concept, right? So they have to divert the attention to something subjective. So when it comes to pricing the product, it's based on subjective qualities of the commodity. But when it comes to actually considering whether a product should be made or not, they are only concerned about the price. So there are these many examples. For example, if a society is only concerned about the price and not the use value. So Marx said there are two kinds of values of commodity: the use value and the exchange value. Use is how important it is to you, what you can use it for. Exchange value is when you take it to the market and sell it. At what value, what is the relative price of that commodity with other commodities? That's the exchange value. So capitalist theory just revolves around exchange value. What is the price that we can get for the commodity? And because the theory is based on demand and supply, what capitalists or corporates try to do is they try to tamper with the demand and supply. On one hand, they're saying it's a free market, government should not interfere. On the other hand, they go about dumping wheat in the ocean because it manipulates the supply and keeps it low and keeps the price artificially high. So you have to understand the hypocrisy of the whole system here, right? Or for instance, NRA is selling guns, they're shooting them. Day before yesterday, there was a shooting in New York in a subway. And instead of actually doing an amendment and saying that people cannot own guns, what happens is that capitalists are surrounding the situation and making profit out of it. So Costco is selling school bags to children which are bulletproof. They're going to school. So you give them bags which are bulletproof. You don't say that, we're going to stop ownership of guns. They are going to make a profit out of a social evil. And you can see, if you look around yourself, you will see that people are making a profit out of social evils. During the pandemic, people were making a killing out of black marketing the cylinders, the oxygen cylinders. So whoever could pay could get the oxygen cylinder. And this is what Mankiw says word for word, right? So I'll talk about the very funny examples that he uses. For instance, if he talks about rationing and price ceiling and price floor, etc., he says it's not efficient. He says that if the government puts a price ceiling on goods and has ration shops where the poor are given certain goods, and he doesn't even use the word poor. He says if a commodity is sold at a price which has a price ceiling, then it's inefficient because it causes queues and there is corruption, etc. However, the example that he uses is an ice cream. He says that, if you have an ice cream, which is you put a price ceiling on an ice cream, there'll be a long lines for ice cream, there'll be corruption in the ice cream market. He does not have the guts to use something like salt or wheat or cooking oil. If that was used, the students would actually think this was illogical. How does it matter if there are queues for cooking oil, as long as the people get it at a subsidized rate? But he will use an example like ice cream. He has used an example like ice cream throughout this chapter on price ceilings, right? And as teachers, I think one way we can reform economics, I don't think our textbooks are changing any time in the near future. What we can do is we can tell them that, look, ice cream is not the right example to use for this, right? There is... this is the funniest example that I found. He says that free markets they make a great case and they're efficient and they're welfare maximizing because they max total surplus in society. What is the example that he gives? He gives the example of the kidney market, the organs trade market. He says that why should the government interfere in the organs trade market? Because there are so many people waiting in hospital for a kidney, and there are so many people willing to donate a kidney, but it's not happening because the government has intervened and said that you can only get kidneys from your relative, etc. There cannot be a market for kidneys. So basically, if you deconstruct what he's saying, or try to look into what he's saying, how dare poor people walk around with 2 kidneys while the rich are dying. So, let's have the poor people give 1 kidney to the rich, and give it not because they're donating it, but because they're dying of hunger. Because they can't get rice, they can't live because they can't feed their children, because they're going to die, they give that kidney. It's not because they're donating. So capitalism will not ask a question saying, why are they donating their kidney for a bag of rice? They're not even converting their religion. They're actually
Monami,
donating.
sorry to interrupt. We should wrap up now.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. So these are the examples. The last example that I'll talk about is, we are saying, like it or not, scalping is a force in the free market. Scalping is just a very dignified word for black marketing. He gives the example of Red Sox tickets, where a person buys the tickets for $11 and somebody buys it for $15, because somebody who can pay deserves that ticket, right? But he's just talking about Red Sox tickets. Not having Red Sox tickets does not kill you, but not having cooking oil, or not having, and if the petroleum prices are really high, which is the case right now, which affects the price of every commodity, if those prices are high, if food grains prices are high, pulses prices are high, then it kills you. So you are saying that black marketing is fine, scalping is fine, and it's something that will happen in a free market, and we should let it happen. And this is what happened during the COVID pandemic in Delhi, where people were scalping oxygen cylinders and ventilators. So these are the examples he uses to tell students that it's very inefficient if governments intervene. But if you actually, if you can tell our students, we should, and also have alternate ways of, or have alternate syllabus, or have a syllabus which includes other alternate theories, because we are giving a very one-sided picture to the students, and they're learning only neoliberal and neoclassical economics, and that's how they are being shaped. So I'll end here, and I'll just say that in these classrooms we should actually ask these questions. Why is there a market for? There should not be a market for organs. There should be voluntary donation of organs in a sensitized world. People should be sensitized enough to donate their organs. Why are we talking about even a world where people are selling their kidneys? And the question we need to ask is, why is someone selling their kidney for rice? Why are they selling it for education? Why is the government not providing all that? And we shouldn't talk about black marketing should be outcome of free markets. We should say that markets have to be regulated when it comes to things like medicines and oxygen, etc. So we have to teach our students to ask the right questions, as long as the textbooks don't change, and also try and push for a change in textbooks. Thank you.
Yes, there was one question in the chat which you can take a look at while we move to the next topic. And the next topic here is with Sara Bardhan on Towards a Feminist Pedagogy in Indian Economics Education. Sara, over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible? Okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Sara, and I'm very excited to be here, also because a lot of professors and scholars who have presented in the past 2 days are people who I have cited in this paper. So it's really exciting for me. And I think my paper is also relevant to what Professor Sinha talked about, because I also talk about neoclassical canon, not in as much depth, but still I argue that neoclassical canon primarily looks at economic actors in a very non-gendered way. So when it looks at economic actors in a non-gendered way, it is incapable, it is inept in understanding and analyzing a lot of work that is done by economic actors, such as childcare and beggary, when we talk about unpaid care work. And so what happens is that not only does our curriculum reach a theoretical impasse, but also what happens is that our course content fails to be relevant to a lot of our students who are present in economics classes. So when I say feminist here, I am referring to inclusive feminist methods in how classrooms can become more inclusive when we talk about Indian economics education. And the first thing I'd like to throw light is that the demographic and socio-political nature of Indian classrooms has undergone a massive shift in the last century. And why I say that is because according to the higher education report published by the Indian government, not only has the number of educational institutions in the last few decades multiplied, but also that the total enrollment of students in these higher educations is seeing a steep rise. So although women's enrollment rate at the outset looks like it's been relatively stable and it has increased only 4 percentage points, when we take a closer look at the gross enrollment ratio, it reveals that women have seen a steady increase since 2011-2012. And as of 2019-2020, when the last report was published, they surpassed men, standing at 27.3 points. But it's also necessary when we try to quantify the shift in classroom dynamics, it's also necessary to look at our classrooms not only from a gender lens, but also from a caste lens. So when we look at it from a caste lens, the statistics are hopefully visible on your screen. We see that although slow and perhaps a long time coming, the gross enrollment ratio, the GER of men belonging to SC communities has seen a growth of 7 points, while SC women have registered a growth of 10.2 points, but they still lag behind SC men overall. And the GER of ST communities is particularly notable because it has been relatively stunted. So we see that since 2011-2012, the GER of both ST men and ST women have increased considerably. But when I say considerably, it's relative because it still falls behind men and women, the average of men and women when we see. And today we know that economics sees the highest enrollment of students in higher education compared to other social sciences in India. And I say this in reference to the AISHE report, which is the All India Survey of Higher Education report, which was last published in 2019-2020. And the report mentions that about 20,000 students are enrolled in a doctorate program in economics in India, and of which 48% are women. And more than 1 lakh students are enrolled in a master's or a PG program in India in economics, of which 59% are women. So while the exact demographic composition of economics educators is unknown, the AISHE report mentions that most associate professors, lecturers, assistant professors are men. And if that is to be applicable to even economics, then we can say, according to the report, that for every 10 male professors, there's only 1 woman professor. So while I am not going to elaborate on hiring practices and why it's relevant to consolidating a feminist pedagogy in Indian classrooms, it is exigent to a feminist pedagogy. And now that we have discussed how the dynamics are changing in Indian classrooms, with these increasingly diverse classrooms, it has become imperative for educators in economics to reflect on the efficiency and relevance and inclusivity of what they teach, how they teach, and why they teach it. And I ask you to reflect on these 4 very important questions, and I hopefully will be able to answer or at least discuss these questions as I move ahead with my presentation. First is, do the current pedagogical practices and curricula enable all students of economics to participate fully and equitably as economic actors? Second is the nature of economics education relevant to all its students? What is the importance of a feminist pedagogy in reconstructing economics education? And then we have, what kind of curricular and pedagogical changes have now become necessary, has become imperative to address this demographic shift? So I am going to be elaborating on 2 critical facets, 2 critical tangents. One is curricula and then is pedagogy, but obviously this is not exhaustive. And I invite all of you to think about what I'm saying here. So first, I'm trying to locate economics education in India. So when we talk about economics curricula, economics started being taught in India as an academic discipline during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the intellectual landscape of that time was dominated by neoclassical theories, which reflects in the curricula that we follow in Indian universities even today. So what we have done is we have adopted the British model of neoclassical economics education without attempting to indigenize the curriculum to accurately reflect and address the socio-economic, historical, political, cultural complexities of Indian societies. So what happens eventually is that what we read or we study in economic classrooms and what we experience as actors outside the world is vastly different. And not only have the debates, criticisms, and controversies surrounding neoclassical theories not been absorbed into the curricula, like Professor Sinha was mentioning, heterodox theories like Marxist economies are notably missing, especially in undergraduate curricula. And it's important to keep in mind that here, our Indian socio-cultural, political, historical realities are so dynamic and diverse across the country that it's not possible for one theoretical framework to fully explain and to fully efficiently explain all of it. So it's necessary for us to add these theoretical approaches. And moreover, a lot of what we study in class, a lot of the readings that are assigned or textbooks that are assigned are written and published by foreign authors, as Professor Sinha was discussing. And frankly, in very simple words, a lot of these case studies, statistics, data are irrelevant to a developing country like India, because a lot of them don't allow students to connect theory to praxis. So what happens when the course readings are irrelevant to our students? They are not able to fully understand their own cultural realities. And not only this, but also economics educators oftentimes don't, especially in universities, oftentimes don't have the autonomy to create their own syllabus. They have to follow the University Grants Commission guidelines regarding the choice-based credit system, and they have to choose core and elective courses based on these guidelines. And here scholars argue that a lot of students may turn away from certain disciplines, including economics, as we are discussing on hand, because at present the classroom tends to be devoid of any sense of community or relevance to these students. So Ernie in 1999 argued that teachers of economics must examine how their classrooms might be excluding increasing number of college students. In other words, if economics educators want to attract and retain a more diverse group of students and want these diverse group of students to go into policy making, to go into the academy, go into monitoring and evaluation, the bureaucracy, etc., it's important that they find ways to make their course content relevant to all their students. The second tangent I'm looking at is pedagogy. So I'm going to start with this quote, which was given by Becker and Watts in 1996 when they criticized educational institutions in the United States. They said that the dominant profile of US undergraduate economics teachers is male, Caucasian, PhD holders who lecture to a class of students as he writes text, equations, graphs on a chalkboard, and who assigns students readings from a standard textbook. Now we see that even though this is a criticism for the classrooms in the United States, it's pretty relevant to what is happening in India even today. And accurately so, pedagogical practices have been characterized as didactic, rote and recitation oriented, and teacher centered. So Kumar 1988 actually wrote that textbooks hold a central space in our central place in our system, and the system in itself offers very little space within which the teachers, within which educators can move. As we discussed before, they practically have no autonomy in creating a syllabus for their own classes. So since that is what we see, the change towards a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom is not only relevant, but it's absolutely necessary, because the dynamics are shifting, and we rote and recitation oriented pedagogical practices are not very effective when we see the larger picture. So when we discuss this, we see that the framework that I'm proposing here calls for the inclusion of diverse economic actors, the incorporation of their economic experiences, so that the syllabus that we read, that we ultimately discuss, is not only relevant, but it's holistic and provides a contextual understanding for all these activities. And it's relevant most of all. And as discussed above, economics, that as it is currently taught in India, considers men as non-gendered actors rather than diverse actors that are constantly influenced by socio-cultural, political, biophysical factors. And instead, syllabi are constructed as if all economic actors are genderless, casteless, classless, and which feminist economists have argued that is irrelevant even for men or dominant classes. So what happens next? To expand this approach, to expand the approach I'm talking about, it is imperative to include traditionally ignored sources of identity, such as caste, class, gender, and sexuality, geographic orientation. And when we do that, we are able to explain a wider variety of economic activity. And not only that, as Professor Sinha mentioned, we have to look at moving beyond a strictly neoclassical framework, because while neoclassical framework, some argue, is useful to discuss and explain some amount of economic activity, there's a lot of economic activity, non-market activities, which are usually performed by women or transgender persons, for example, that are typically not very, that neoclassical framework is typically not very useful in explaining or analyzing. And when we move beyond a strictly neoclassical framework, we can also analyze activities such as activities and behaviors such as altruism, reciprocity, cooperation, and redistribution. And noting what sociologist Margaret Anderson said, she said that instead of adding sporadic examples of women or Black people in their textbooks, it's important for economics textbooks to incorporate these identities more seamlessly into their texts, so that it creates a more well-rounded, more holistic and contextual understanding of how these identities affect economic activity. For in the Indian context, it may be geographical orientation, it may be caste, it may be gender, these identities. And here to incorporate, for example, when we speak of gender, here to incorporate gender more seamlessly into our text, it's important to add, modify, edit, revise, recognize data that reflect women's experiences and marginalized communities' experiences, diverse persons' experiences beyond these neoclassical constraints. And it's also, I think, relevant to mention that two scholars, Porter and Serra, in 2020 conducted a study where they tried to understand what's the importance of female role models for female students of economics. And they found out that having women role models was particularly relevant for female students of economics, and a lot of them chose economics as their major. The one who had female role models chose economics as their majors. So finally, the last point is that when all of this is done, it's also important to challenge neoclassical orthodoxy and question its relevance. And it's important to draw from heterodox approaches and critiques of neoclassical approach to reinvent course content in economics, because usually economics is taught as a subject that has progressed linearly without any internal conflicts of its own. But however, not only is course content important, it's also important to see how we teach this course content, which brings me to my next point, which is feminist pedagogy. So Bernstein in 1990 noted that in discussing pedagogic discourse, scholars rarely look at how pedagogic communication is a special form of communication, because in pedagogic communication, the production of knowledge and knowledge structures must be reworked to act as a medium for marginalized voices such as class, caste, gender, ethnicity, among others. So the first suggestion here that I make is to create a collaborative learning environment. And when usually what happens in Indian classrooms is that students they listen passively to their teachers, and such classes tend to have a very poor student-teacher ratio as well. So in order to foster interaction, and in order to foster participation, it's important that we create a collaborative learning environment where we try to experiment with alternative pedagogical practices, such as Socratic method, where the onus of learning is removed from only the student, where the student is individually learning something, and the sole authorities in the classroom is only the teacher and the textbook, but where students can speak with each other, with student through open dialogue and conversation can compare and contrast and connect their thoughts and ideas and achieve a greater understanding of the subject. And now that I've covered a basic understanding of what I believe is moving towards a feminist classroom, it's important. Feminist classrooms are not only defined by these two tangents, that is curricula and pedagogy. There are a lot more that goes into it. Like I said, it's not an exhaustive presentation, but I implore you to think on these lines that I've mentioned here. And because we have to understand the intersection of pedagogy and curricula, and we have to rethink and reconstruct The traditional assessment techniques like final or year-end examinations, are these useful? Are these really efficient? We have to understand the role of textbooks in an evolving and diverse feminist classrooms. Which textbooks are to be used? Are textbooks to be used at all? And the teaching of teachers, which is the feminist methods to train educators. So in order to manifest, in order to transform a classroom into a feminist space, in a feminist educational space, it's important to also train the educators who are central to creating these classrooms. There can't be a feminist classroom without a feminist educator. So here's where I end my presentation. I am really happy to be here. I thank all the organizers. And if anyone has any questions, suggestions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And thank you for listening to me patiently.
Thanks very much, Sara. There was a very, very comprehensive and radical quite a manifesto, across the board. It's not just simply about including women, as it were, but about pedagogy, about spaces. So it was very, very interesting for me to hear. There is one question that's there in question and answer, which you can maybe take a look at. And I don't know if you want to respond there or, when we have question and answers. So last but certainly not least, we have Surbhi Kesar, who will be speaking on designing a pluralist curriculum, key aspects and potential pitfalls. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Arjun. I'll begin by sharing my screen. Okay, I'm able to share it now. All right. So first of all, I'm definitely very excited to be invited to share some thoughts on this panel. One, because this is one of my home institutions, Satyavati College, and there's a lot of people who've trained me in economics who are in attendance. I'm very excited. And it's being chaired by Arjun, who's been a senior colleague and a mentor. So I'm definitely very excited to be here. So what I'm going to do today, I'm not presenting a paper, but I want to share a few thoughts, which I guess will relate to some of the presentations that have already comprehensively dealt with the issue. The idea is, what is pluralism, I guess, is a question, and there have been a lot of discussions that have already been happening over the course of these last few days. But just to unpack what is the implications of it by way of a couple of examples, what can be the limits, and where do we go from pluralism? Do we end, or is this an initial point of inquiry that we are beginning with? So those are kind of few threads that I'm going to build upon. So what is a pluralist approach to economics? It is something where we talk about distinct theoretical frameworks to understand the object of analysis. What are these distinct theoretical frameworks? There can be many, but three key frameworks in economics have been neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian. The point here is, following Resnick and Wolff, the contestations between these different schools of thought are not merely a contestation of just different tools being used, but rather the difference is much more fundamental in nature, both in terms of the entry point to the theory, as well as the implications of the chosen theory. Why is it, to what extent do the entry point determine how we understand an object of analysis, and what can be the implication of it is something that we're trying to argue here is something that's much more fundamental in nature and what we're going to explore. However, when there are these different theoretical strands of understanding, then the question becomes, why is it that one of the strands becomes more objective in understanding something, and why? Of course, there's a role of power here. We're talking about social sciences where there are various different ways of making sense of exactly the same process. A related question that also appears is that what is the role of colonization in shaping the way knowledge gets produced and accepted? Because, if we think about it, that development economics as an entire project comes into being as a special subject or a special discipline that was to understand these quote unquote aberrant economies, as if the economics of the West couldn't even be, what is normal economics couldn't even be applied to the economies of the global South who were just coming out of colonization. And a new subject itself had to come into being, a discipline had to come into being, which could understand the economies of the global South. So what were these theoretical entry points that we began with? A neoclassical framework takes individual preferences, resource endowments, and technology as some of the entry points to the theory. A Keynesian entry point is more in terms of mass psychology, power of institutions, animal spirits governing investment decisions. And whereas a Marxian entry point is that of a class, which can be understood as the process of production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus. Of course, I won't be getting into the details of it, but I'm going to discuss by way of two small examples that what are the implications of it. The examples that I'm going to draw upon is the idea of Eurocentrism in economics, and the second is the issue of identity in economics. But given the time, as I said, I won't be getting into a lot of details for any of these. So what is Eurocentrism in economics? This is something that has been explored by various different schools of, various different sort of strands within heterodoxy. What the position that I'm going to take here is that the idea that an endogenous capitalist development in Europe and the associated Enlightenment values of rationality and objectivity, when it is considered as the locus and is expected to unfold throughout the world, is something that we are understanding is Eurocentrism. And this understanding, when becomes a locus of a particular theory or of a particular understanding, can be said to why a theory is, let's say, Eurocentric. When we take this as the locus of the understanding, realities everywhere else are seen as mere deviations or aberrations from the European experience, and not just in terms of quote unquote economic experiences, even the social processes that do not, like non-economic social processes, be it in terms of identity and so on and so forth, that do not align with this imagination are devalued as imperfections. So then in this idea, when we say something about Eurocentrism in economics, is Europe simply a geographical entity? My submission here is no. We're talking about a metaphorical Europe that represents what the essence of capitalism was supposed to be. And everything else that does not align to it is seen as aberrations. And that's why you can see a Europe in every global south economy, and you can probably see pockets of non-European within the European economies, because we're talking about a metaphorical Europe which represents the essence of capitalism. And that's kind of the relationship between capitalism and capitalist development and Eurocentrism. This therefore leads to exclusion of all those strands that do not celebrate the vision of capitalism, while the exclusion becomes even more intensive for global South-centric strands. So when you do not take this as the locus of the understanding dictated by that we are living under a global hegemony of capitalism, every other strand that does not celebrate this vision as the utopian vision to somehow achieve are indeed excluded. Therefore, it's not surprising that heterodox strands, and particularly given your, where you lie on the spectrum of radicalism, will be excluded more, even within the global North contexts. What then happens in these understandings is that processes of colonialism, slave trade, drain of wealth, racial violence, among other forms of structural subordination that have underpinned the development of capitalism in Europe, while simultaneously restricting this possibility of this realization elsewhere, are absent from this understanding. This is not to say that mainstream doesn't understand colonialism. Of course, there is one understanding which is called this blind spots approach, where you can still introduce ideas of colonialism and slave trade within the mainstream understanding, but I'm going to try to develop it in a while, that what is kind of distinct in terms of the Eurocentric understanding that we're talking about here. In addition, all forms of oppression that development of capitalism was founded upon and continues to rely upon in order to maintain stable regimes of accumulation are just swept under the carpet. Now let's look at it even in terms of development of capitalism in global North. The idea often is that quote unquote underdeveloped economies is something as if it's a prehistory of capitalism, and they need to undergo the same sort of transition that, let's say, the first world does. However, a lot of dependency theorists and other post-colonial theorists will tell us that it was the development of capitalism that produced capitalist development in the global North and capitalist underdevelopment in the global South. So there's a common historical process that is producing both these states and are making them come into being, which kind of questions that locus that we kind of began with. Similar, that's one example, and I'll be relating that to the mainstream theory in just a bit. The second example is that of how the issue of identity is understood in economics. And here as well, there's, broadly, we can think about core neoclassical approaches would start with an individualizing paradigm, when, let's say, the older theories is that of a taste-based discrimination by Becker, who would talk about, like, till the time you have a taste to discriminate, even if you have to pay extra for it, you would be willing to do it. So let's say a white employer will have a preference for hiring white employees and would therefore be willing to pay higher wages to the person. However, the argument still being that with perfectly competitive markets, or with competitive markets in general, this sort of an employer will be competed out. However, decades later, people saw that there was no competing out happening. And the new theory, statistical discrimination, comes into being. And the idea then is to explain why this is not going away. And which then becomes that, look, it's actually a rational choice by an individual to actually discriminate, because you do not really know the productivity or some characteristics of the person that you're hiring. You just have some observable characteristics, and you form certain understanding of that person based on their group characteristics, based on information that you might have or stereotypes that you might have. However, again, it becomes a self-reinforcing process. In any of these two theories, what we are talking about is an individual-centric approach, which is centered towards explaining why discrimination has continued to exist and why it hasn't gone away. Even within statistical discrimination, the idea is that if you have better information, if the employers have better information, this is something that would get corrected over time. A lot of mainstream theory now is kind of discussing what part of the entire discrimination is taste-based versus what part is statistical in nature. And that's kind of one of the major discussions. Similarly, then there's a lot of other approaches that I can't get into, but then of course there's a whole set of radical approaches which are talking about these processes of racialization, the processes of gendering, so on and so forth, as something that co-evolve with the production structures of the economy. How is it that racialization comes into being with the development of capitalism? What is the role of colonialism with the development of capitalism? How is it that the process of production, appropriation, distribution of surplus co-constitutes the racializations, the different processes of racialization and gendering, is something that becomes a part of the radical theories, particularly those coming from Marxist, feminist, anti-racist, Black radical tradition, critical race tradition, where there's a co-constitutivity of the process of class and of other identities. So it's not something that, okay, you are under the system, now let's see how the discrimination is happening and how an individual is discriminating. Rather, the issue becomes, what is the process through which this current economic system is coming into being, and then changing and altering and interacting with all these other different social processes of identity. And that's kind of one of the core distinctions that we're trying to make. So now, do these different ways of understanding, let's say about Eurocentrism, about understanding processes of identity, is there a fundamental difference in what we are talking about? Which school of thought do we take and do we begin with? The idea here is, yes, mainstream of economics does center in some way the vision of capitalism as its utopia, and that's kind of been a utopian vision. And the theoretical framework, which relies on this individualizing paradigm, makes it challenging to see, and these are some keywords, structural inequalities, exploitation and domination, and what I was just talking about, the mutual interaction of economic and other social processes, and particularly the inherent contradictions under capitalism. The fact, and these are certain contradictions that are much more likely to reveal themselves if one was to, let's say, understand by with a different entry point, let's say that of a class process, because by way of choosing class, what you're highlighting are these contradictions. And that is something, and of course, there's been a lot of interesting research going on and trying to think about how within the individualizing paradigm can we bring in more endogeneity to see and to highlight certain of these contradictions. However, what we're trying to put forward here is that we can begin with a different entry point that is more likely to reveal these processes of structural subordination and these processes of contradictions. So of course, every theoretical framework with its entry point is able to occlude and reveal different kind of processes much more easily versus the other. Of course, within this paradigm, as I said, realities of global South are seen as mere imperfections. and contradictions and antagonisms that are centrally embedded in capitalism, be it between capital and labor, be it between the sphere of capitalist and non-capitalist production, so on and so forth, that may keep this utopia elusive, are in fact peripheral or absent in the mainstream of economics today. So similar to theory is the issue of ontology, when we are thinking about, how this understanding is not just something that exists, but rather is proposed as being objective and universal, which makes the criticisms of it much more hard. And further, with the strengthening of the formalization of economic theories, though a very useful tool, and with the empirical term, as Esther Duflo had remarked, that the results are what they are, but they're not, right? Like, we're using categories a particular way. There's various different things that we are occluding and accepting to show the results of how they are. I guess, Arjun, am I running out of time?
You have 5 more minutes, 6 more minutes.
Okay, thanks. So then, as I said, can these processes not be introduced within the mainstream of economics? Of course, there have been ways in which colonialism, racism, and other forms of oppression are indeed introduced. But what we are talking about is that certain theoretical apparatus and certain theoretical entry points are more amenable to questioning the systemic oppressions and processes. And it is those kind of theoretical entry points and those kind of theoretical apparatus that we are talking about bringing to forth. For example, as I've already pointed out, non-determinist Marxian traditions that talk about co-constitution of various social processes with economic processes, I believe, become more amenable to studying something like this. So then a related question becomes, what about economics teaching? I think economics research has still made a lot of stride. There's a lot that's happening in labor economics, particularly when you start with wage bargaining as your starting point rather than wages equal to marginal productive labor. And I think those are very interesting advancements that need to be accepted. Of course, even in these research, the imports from what heterodox theories these are imported from are still not recognized, even if they do begin with a wage bargaining. However, the thing, and that's been pointed out a lot in the last presentation, talking about ManQ, the whole principles approach, and I don't think I need to get to it and reiterate it, but this idea of thinking like an economist, what students need to be trained in, remains central. So what about, I think I'm going to skip this entire slide because I think a lot of these discussions have already happened. So just a few survey results from a survey that I conducted with one of my co-authors on one of the papers, Ingrid Kwan-Graven, where this is of 500 economists across the world, where people are asked to answer whether they agree or, whether they agree with these statements or not. And the idea is that, let's look at the first one. Do you think that we need to move away from textbook teaching? 41% agree that we do need to. And of course, the proportion is much lower for mainstream economics than for other, the economists in heterodox or pluralist departments. Whether we need to tell students to stop thinking like an economist, because ManQ's famous dictum is to think like an economist, as if there is only one way to think like an economist. Again, 23% of mainstream only say that we need to stop thinking like this, while 56 to 60% in pluralist heterodox departments and non-economics departments say that we need to do so. If we just look at the last one, which is whether to teach courses in structural racism and colonialism and empire, again, only 38% of those in mainstream departments say that they do teach such courses, whereas 84 and 87% in pluralist heterodox or non-economics departments say so. So there's clearly this distinction that's happening in terms of how we are approaching economics teaching, depending on the kind of schools of thought that we belong to. So I'm going to skip over a lot of survey results. I'm happy to come back to it if there are any questions. But, one thing, when the American Economic Association on Graduate Education in Economics in 1991 had a report on graduate economic, graduate economics teaching, and where one of the, people like Larry Summers and others were also part of it. And one of the things that they came out with as a conclusion was that the Commission's fear is that graduate programs may be turning out a generation with too many idiot sound skills and technique, but innocent to real economic issues. However, the point is all of our economics research and teaching has been geared towards creating very skilled individuals innocent to real economic issues. And we've been changing our economics education more and more towards it by extricating economics from the sphere of political contestations. So this is not a surprising result, but so many decades later, we're still probably taking a turn in some ways for the worse. So my concluding slide. So what happened? So the concluding slide. So what about pluralism? I think as a teaching tool, pluralism is very powerful because it is about introducing students to different schools of thought, entry point, methods, and frameworks. You're telling students how you begin with certain tools, certain set of bare bones, and how you construct an entire model of it. How do you understand something based on that? However, pluralist movements, various brilliant pluralist movements throughout the world, want to keep themselves distinct from any political contestations. And that is something that they are very clear about. However, the point here is that economics is a sphere of political contestation. Which theory becomes dominant? What is the implication of which theory becoming dominant? What is the implication of that for the system that we are a part of? Is in fact a political contestation. And ever since, you see, economics is called economics now, it's political economy. And this extrication that we are doing is that about the question of idiot servants that we begin with. So I guess what I want to kind of end with is to just say that pluralism is a very important and interesting way to begin and introduce students to. But what needs to be bridged, in my opinion, is that what is the implication of choosing a different schools of thought? Because it's not just about how you're studying, but it's about certain implications of it. And what is it that you want to suggest as a part of your policy interventions or as a part of your political organizations? And knowledge, no matter in what form it exists, is an extremely politicized engagement that we are a part of. And I think it's the repoliticization of knowledge and why and how certain discourses become dominant and what is the implications of their dominance is something that pluralism, I feel, needs to bridge than what it is right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Surbhi. Thanks very much. That was comprehensive and challenging right through. And this sort of brings us to the end of the last presentation. There are many questions that have been asked, and some of them really could go to more than one person. But maybe I would like to begin with a question, right? I mean, this is something, and it's for everybody, and then maybe we can go to each one of those specific questions, and people can address them either together. I'll try to collate them, or when there are specific questions. I noticed that Sara, for example, had typed out an answer already to one. We can get to that, but here's my question, right? So there may be someone who's listening to this and who is in the position of having to design an entire curriculum. Right? We know that there are constraints all over the world for many reasons. And this happens to all of us as educators when we take up a subject, right? We say, okay, I want to teach this, and I want to teach this, and I want to teach this, and I want to teach that, right? So if you were to design something, and we're talking about an overall curriculum, what is it that you would want to give up? Right? What is it that we would say, look, we should not teach in the undergraduate, or it's not important to teach in the undergraduate, in order to, for example, let's say, make a course like Radhika is suggesting, or a pedagogy like Sara is suggesting, or even, for example, a Marxian economics course. Do we leave these, from what you're all saying, we shouldn't be leaving these as just electives? You seem to be suggesting something much deeper than that. So what is it that we would want to give up? And why? So that's my question to all of you. Then we can open up to, maybe we'll go in order, Radhika, Monami, Sara, and Surbhi. Maybe you can try that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very tough question to answer as to what should we give up, because I remember Monami was saying that this course on economic systems in their university, they have discontinued. But I definitely think that's something that one should continue. So it probably happened in many universities after the breakdown of the Soviet Union and 1992 onwards. Similarly, a paper on history of economic thought. This is also a paper very, very often is not taught at all in a lot of universities. So I don't think that you can give up some of these basic courses. You need to give them up. It's only possible that depending upon the faculty and the ideology which they have, they would need to twist and turn the way in which it is approached. That's the only solution to this whole thing. What we as faculty could do is introduce to the students these newer concepts and ideas, give them examples, show them live cases, show them the research work which is going on in that particular area, how modern research has suggested that some of the earlier ideas are a little outdated, and then leave it to the students to decide what they want to do. That's my take on this.
Okay, so I mean, that is the concern, right? In some sense, everything that you said is in addition. There's nothing that you're saying that we could give up.
No.
In that. Okay. So
I find it very difficult to say that what can we give up. Yes, that's what I said.
Okay. Monami, you're not visible, but maybe you can take up the question, because you had a very forceful statement about making sure that they learn, for example, labor theory of value. So maybe you can say what it is that one can actually give up. I mean, this is a very practical question, not as a trick question at all, because this is something that if we are really serious, we want to change, we would have to say there are certain things we don't want to do and we don't think is useful, either because it's wrong or because we're already doing so much of it in other places. So maybe Monami, you can take this up. Or maybe I'm not able to see if she's on. Maybe we can. Okay, so then maybe we'll just move to Sara. You can, for you to take this up next, and then.
I think I have a similar position of that same question, because it's so difficult even as a student to think. I'm rethinking of all my courses that I have studied, and it's so difficult to think about letting something go, because even though I personally may not identify or I may not find a certain theory logical, but it is important to study all of them because it's relevant. And I do personally think that theories like history of economics, like I suggested in my paper itself, economics is generally taught as a subject that has progressed linearly. So it is important to study the contradictions. It's important to study the history of it. And all these are, but I also think that if we want to add all of these subjects back again into our curricula, we have to think about removing something that is currently being taught. But it's a difficult debate, and I think it demands extensive discussion. Maybe one more webinar can be organized for the same purpose.
Okay, so two people who are leaving this outside the off stump, as it were. That's fair. I mean, Monami, I don't know if you heard my question. So I was asking, in general, I mean, I think I agree with everybody that there are wonderful alternative traditions to understanding many things, whether it's the many heterodox approaches that Surbhi spoke about, a feminist pedagogy, a gender course, or labor theory values you were speaking. But my question was, if you were really to design a curriculum, and we know that time is limited when we're teaching, what would one give up? Would you throw out Mankyo entirely and do something else, for example? What do you give up and say, we shouldn't teach this?
We don't have to give up anything if we just, for instance, why do we have the semester system in Delhi University? We could have an annual system which gives enough time for in-depth learning of all concepts. And why do we have to hurry up these concepts? This whole concept of quantity over quality is something that's happening in Delhi University, which I don't agree with. That you can dedicate one whole year to understanding consumer theory and the various ways it's dealt with by different thinkers. And there is absolutely no dearth of time. It's all, again, that's a capitalist concept, dearth of time. You can spend a lot of years learning, just learning.
It's interesting because, I mean, I'm not sure that when we're teaching our courses, we feel like we have plenty of time. It seems to feel like for many of us, the time is really sort of compressed.
We don't, because we are just crowding out the whole year with so many concepts. What I'm trying to say is, yeah.
So if I get what you're saying that we would teach 1 year of consumer theory with taking 3 different approaches, for example. Is that,
why not?
Would that be
yes.
Okay. All right. But then there's possibility that they would never get to produce a theory, and would it be okay?
In the second year, maybe.
And you know where I'm going with this, right? I mean, there has to be some sort of theory.
But this whole hurried up thing is a very capitalist concept. You have to understand that. We are always in a hurry. We have to be productive. It's all something that has been ingrained in us in a capitalist society. Why can't learning be at ease?
I'm not going to contest that. I'm just saying that as instructors, we still
do we have time? So do we have time? So I can tell you a very interesting anecdote about the Vietnam War and the semester system.
Let's go to Surbhi, and then if we can come back with as many questions. Okay, so Surbhi.
Thanks, Arjun, for the question. I'm not sure if I'm going to do justice to the question either, but however, I also think teaching is not supposed to be exhaustive, right? No matter what we teach, there will be stuff that will be left out, and that's something designing a course we know when we begin with. So then the question is, what is it that we are prioritizing? At least I think what we need to prioritize in any curriculum is to train students how to think. And I feel that's one thing that is left out. How is it that you're training students how to think? And
how to think like an economist? No,
how to think. Because I think that's exactly what's not done. Because, I mean, of course, there are courses and curriculums across the world that do that, but in generally. Because, so what would that entail? For me, it's about giving students the idea of these different entry points. What is the contestations amongst it? What is it? How do you build that theoretical framework? And what are the tools in each of these? And then you can have several different economic concepts which you can analyze from each of these theories. So the way I try to think about it is that there are 3 levels of critiques that we are always engaging with to training how to think. One is within a theory, then what are these different advancements that have happened, let's say in identity, within mainstream, so on and so forth. How is it that a theory progresses? So a theory within a school of thought progresses as well. So to give students the schools of thought to analyze how the progress happens. The second level of critique is that between different schools of thought, then what does it mean to take one entry point versus another? And third is the third critique of economics as a discipline itself, of its role in the entire society. So I think it's these 3 levels of critique and thinking through it and giving students the tools and frameworks to analyze it that need to be introduced, that I think should be mandatory for everyone to attend. And after that, one can pick up a course on labor or a course on identity or a course on whatever and give students these optionals, which will be a lot more applications of these frameworks and tools and theories. So for me, that is like a given. And the other things is picking and choosing things with which you apply. So that shouldn't mean that if students, that should mean that if students know a certain tools and a set of frameworks, they should be apt enough that if they were to pick up those, even for a course that they haven't been taught, they should be able to apply it and understand those issues. So it's about that training of thinking.
Great, thanks. It's helpful because I think you're right that it does need, we sometimes make the mistake. I think this was what Monami was also saying, that we need to be exhaustive in everything. Maybe we don't. So that's very helpful. There's many questions. I'm going to pick a couple which may be more generally applicable. And for the others, for example, Radhika, there's a couple of questions which are very specific about your talk, or maybe you could answer it online. But the question that that seemed to be there, which I think is useful and that Samriddhi asks and really applies to everybody. When you have places like DU or other places where there are prescribed syllabi, what are the ways in which one can actually go about doing, the kind of somewhat radically different ways of teaching? That's the question. And I mean, she posed it much better. It says, in a public university like DU with multiple structural constraints, how can professors at the individual levels make students aware? Can this become a collective action amongst professors who advocate for pluralism? So may any one of you can take it up, and Surbhi too, even though I think you have a sense of this space. So maybe Monami, maybe we can start with you. And Sarah.
See, the teachers have been trained in this system, right? They also have not been exposed to an alternate thought. So to make it a collective system, will actually have to begin with the teachers and have to begin with a discussion where we are open to discuss everything and our voices are not throttled. And we are open to all theories. But on an individual level, of course, I keep doing this in class all the time. I keep telling them that what I'm teaching you can be looked at in a different way. And this, instead of the ice cream example, think of it as a example in rice or wheat and all that. However, I've had the opportunity to be trained under some people who exposed me to that thought. A lot of people are not. And they go on to become teachers, and wonderful teachers at that. I'm not judging them as teachers, but what do you do about that? The fact that they have been not trained in this alternate thought or exposed to it.
Okay.
So, Arjun, can I go next?
Yeah. Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So, I have been teaching for about 32 plus years. So in these years, what I have seen is that there's an entire paradigm shift in the way in which the government also has been looking at higher education. So at one time, there were only state universities. Now you have private state universities. You have autonomous, colleges. You have deemed to be universities. All these have come up because of this fact. Like, say, for example, I was with affiliated college in the University of Mumbai, which had 700 and odd colleges which were affiliated to it. So some of the people, like, say me, if I was the chairperson of a particular course, international economics, and we suggested that there should be some change in the syllabus, the first thing that people from, say, a Savantwadi college would say that, look, a Xavier's college student can pick up these kind of concepts. But in our case, we do not even have the wherewithal to teach our students the same thing. We do not have the material to teach because we are teaching in Marathi and things like that. So that's where things are changing now, where the government says, okay, if it's a Xavier's college, give them autonomy, let them teach it in a different way. And then for those fewer colleges who do not have that wherewithal, they have these workshops every time a syllabus is changed. And these workshops used to be only 1 or 2 in, for the every time that this syllabus used to be changed. Now they have several of these workshops and at clusters. So more people can attend and they can understand how they need to impart, that particular syllabus or curriculum. What is the objective? What should be the course outcomes? So things are changing. Ours is a very, very huge country. We need much more patience, and I think we're getting there.
Sara, Surbhi? Either one.
Should I go next, or is Surbhi going next? Okay. I think the last point in my presentation was also about the teaching of teachers, which was training feminist educators. And that's why I emphasized it, because I also think that educators are central to imparting the knowledge that we are discussing here, the knowledge structure, the production, reproduction of knowledge. And here, by feminist educators, I not only mean people who are apt in understanding and imparting heterodox approaches, but also who are apt in creating collaborative learning environments. So especially when it comes to our courses, I think that since I don't think the system of final examinations or the system of these assessments is going to change anytime soon. But I think on a personal level, what can be done if there is any autonomy when it comes to assignments, or when there is any autonomy when it comes to how these assessments are taking place, when it comes to these maybe midterms or semester-wise assignments, and how, for example, what can be done if there's a very practical example, what if there's a 30-mark assignment coming up, what can be done is it can be divided into two parts. Maybe half of it can be done as a group activity, and group activity in the sense where it's a real collaboration, not where only one person is taking charge and the rest of them are tagging along. But I think these are things that need to be explored in depth, because I don't think that these are something that everyone has grown up with, and these are some things we need to be trained in how to create real collaboration, how to create real dialogue between two people, between groups, and how we can, on a personal level, at least if there is no systemic change, how we can on a personal level change these things in our classrooms.
Thanks, Sarah. Surbhi.
Thanks. Just two quick things. One is in terms of, I think I'll start on a pessimistic note. I guess like those various global south countries actually have historically had a very critical approach to education and economics teaching, which has particularly changed in the past post liberalization, and that is something that's probably happened in Delhi University as well. And those in global south are actually under even higher pressure to emulate, because you always want to be in the top departments and the top journals, which means to make the cut, and therefore there's higher pressure. There was the name of the authors I can't remember, but there was a World Bank working paper which actually said that one of the reasons why the global south economies are bad is because they're not teaching students the frontier of what is economics education. But of course, it's not the frontiers. It's a very political thing why it's a frontier. So in that sense, there are these structural constraints, and that everybody has already mentioned. But also, there's a pessimism of intellect, but optimism of the will, as Gramsci would put it. So the optimism is to take advantage of, I think, the really bad bureaucracy, South Asian bureaucracy. There's nobody seeing in the classroom what's really happening. I guess I should also identify that with my positionality, the two institutions have been extremely open to critical thought. So that's not been an issue that I've faced. But having been from the same university system, you have a curriculum, but there's so many ways to introduce and sneak in these very critical ways of thinking and understanding. And I think that was done by my teachers, some of whom are here right now. And I think that makes a huge change of how to understand the same object from, and these possibilities of inflections and ruptures are many, and sometimes that does take shape. So that's, I think, the contradictory relation in some ways.
Thanks very much. There's a couple of questions which I'll group together and that have been posed, which is, I suppose, the question of representation. So this question clearly following Sarah's and Radhika's presentations about gender representation among teachers. I'm very grateful, by the way, to the organizers for the composition of this group, precisely for this reason. But should we be looking, therefore, at, if we're really interested in a much more pluralistic thing, for Keynesian economists, Marxian economists, feminist economists to be in each of these departments? Now, obviously, that's going to be very good. Or are we going to say that we're going to make sure that these are taught, these kind of ideas are taught by anybody, right? So these are somewhat distinct kind of strategies. And maybe you could reflect a little bit on them. I'd like to start with Sara, and then with Radhika, and then maybe Surbhi and Monami.
Actually, I didn't really get your question, so I think I'll go through the question and then take time to.
Yeah, sorry. So there are two specific questions about women, women's labor force participation and so on. That's separate that you can answer. And I was trying to group the. So
I'll just answer on the chat box itself. That's all.
Yeah, that would be great. No, but I was saying specifically some of the things that were being all of you brought up was the question of representation. So my question is it's obviously it's important to have representation. How do we go about this? And the second thing is there the alternative strategies to make sure that regardless of background, everyone teaches all these kind of pluralistic approaches? Some reflections on those kind of two different strategies. And I'd like to start with Sarah, and then we can go to Radhika.
I think someone in the chat box asked a question about how reservations make sense into what I was talking about when it comes to representation. And while I think it demands very extensive discussion, but I also at the same time think that simply hiring women or maybe hiring more Marxist economists or gender diverse persons, more lecturers, might not translate into creating a feminist classroom, because, and I use feminist as inclusive, like I said before, but not everyone who may be, let's say, a gender diverse person will be feminist in the way I am suggesting. So what happens then? That's what I'm trying to say, that hiring practices might not always translate to inclusivity. And in the same breath, I also say that we also, even if we hire people like that, let's think of a transgender lecturer being hired into DU. What happens next? What position? What is the power dynamic of the person within that institution? So as an educator, as a teacher, what is that person going through, and how will that reflect in the classroom? So I think representation is interesting as a question. And also when it comes to just, when it comes to a feminist classroom, I think the importance should be given to retraining and training the educators who are already there, and reorienting the classrooms that are present. And then we should look at reservation, we should look at representation. I don't mean to say that it's not a priority, but I feel like it may be useful to go in this order. And like you said, I think you said that should Keynesian economics be taught only by Keynesian economists, or Marxist economics be taught by Marxist economists? I don't think that's the goal here. I think the goal, like everybody mentioned in the last question, is to train educators in a way that they are able to impart the course content no matter what their background is. And like Professor Lobo mentioned, that there are workshops, for example, in the colleges that she mentioned, that so that they are able to translate that information to the students. So the goal isn't to hire only those particular people who are scholars in their fields, but the goal is to make sure that everyone can impart all of these approaches.
Okay, thanks. So that's door 2 is what you're suggesting. Okay, Radhika, Surbhi.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Sara mentioned, the idea is that when I said that there should be a paper like gender economics, to be honest, I myself started teaching this paper just a couple of years ago. So I don't know if I was a feminist and therefore I was asked to teach this paper. I don't know. I'm happy to be one if that is the reason that I was asked to teach. But I just feel that sensitizing students was a very, very important thing. And small things like just before our session, we had Padmini Ram on this session. She used to be my colleague and a very dear friend at Christ University. And she was mentioning that on a World Bank project that she was working on, it was a one-year project, and she was asked to give an undertaking that she will not take maternity leave. So if Arjun has to apply for that project, he wouldn't have to, right? So it's blatant, it's very clear. And then so this kind of sensitization, and it's coming from an organization like World Bank, which has a subsidiary called ADB, which is promoting infrastructure. 55% I mentioned in my presentation, which should be in category 1 and 2, which is directly promoting, giving benefits to women. So my whole point over here is that we need to sensitize everybody about it. And that's the reason that we should be including these kind of courses. But who should teach it is, definitely someone who has been trained in it. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat. So I think. think it has to be someone who has been trained in it. So these refresher courses and orientation courses, which are conducted either by UGC or other kinds of bodies, you can have specialized ones so that people can refresh their knowledge on specific new areas. Yeah.
Thanks. Surbhi, Monami to Surbhi and then Monami, just the order in which I can see you.
Thanks. Yeah, again, I don't think I have a lot to add, but agree that different schools of thought, of course, it's people who are trained in those schools of thought need to teach it, because otherwise, for me to teach something that I've not been trained in, of course, it's a big thing, unless I'm ready to, put in the years to train myself to do that. However, second thing is that I guess it's a very big question to what extent positionality matters. And I think so it's like, it's no surprise that a lot more women work on gender economics or feminist economics, right? And there is a correlation there. And I feel that it is important, that can't be the ends, but I do think that's a very important starting point to begin with. Similarly, to what extent, and I guess this is something that we even find in the survey that we conducted, that there was, in fact, if people had let's say, so the correlations were of the kind that if people had experienced some sort of marginalization, they were much more likely to teach courses on structural racism and colonialism and so on and so forth. So there are those personal things that come in. Of course, it's also true that those people who will be from underprivileged identities will in fact be even under higher pressure to emulate and make the cut. So it's that two-way thing, but yeah.
Thanks, Surbhi. Monami, sir. Monami?
Yeah. So just as an example, I did my graduate studies from the US and from Boston College. And I specialized in international trade, where we were being taught a comparative advantage, which is one of the basic underlying neoclassical theories of trade. And it was very shocking for me that how it is taught, comparative advantage is taught, is by one example, in which they say that in trade between India and Britain, the Indian cloth, the Indian fabric, the Indian cloth lost out because of comparative advantage. So they try to use economics to explain what is basically the most brutal history of imperial power. And the fact that these markets were actually systematically destroyed, and weavers had their fingers cut off, and things like that. So that's what I mean by saying that we don't want to go that way. At least in India, we should have a system of learning where students learn that this is our history, this is how we came about the capitalist system, and these are the alternates. And if you, I don't know about SOAS, but I have heard from my friends in foreign universities where humanities is taught from the point of view of the colonizer and not the colonized. And I, at least in India, want my students to learn humanities, at least in the beginning, from the point of view of the colonized and the oppressed. That's all I want to say. Why are we going towards economics, which is oppressive and which has a history of oppression?
Okay, thanks. There's many more questions which we could have. Things have been very lively. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to really get all the questions in the question and answer. If there are things that people want to respond to, suggestions for books and so on, I'm sure you can actually contact anyone on the panel. They'd be willing to give that, or maybe somebody we can collect some of these answers for people for later. But I'm aware we're over time, and we've got one more panel coming up in about half an hour. But I'd like to thank everyone here for a very stimulating discussion, and something that I think people will take to their classrooms over the next months and years. So thanks very much, and bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. It was a really great session to learn from all of you on all these pertinent topics in the economics discipline. And thank you to the presenters for actually taking out your time and sharing your work with us. And we would like to extend our thanks full note to Arjun, Jayadev for chairing this session and anchoring the discussion today, and to Surbhi for your input and being a wonderful discussant. We have the closing keynote address by Monami Sinha coming up next. the details of which are dropped in the chat box, and we request you all to join at 6:30 p.m. The same link can be used to join the next session. Thank you, everyone, and see you all soon again.
Thanks. Bye.